La verdad es que pues, yo estoy muy contento y lo quería, lo quería comentar porque al final en estos foros a veces habla un poco de la emoción que sentimos la gente que estamos en estas cosas, ¿no? Yo estoy ilusionado, estoy muy contento de ver la cantidad de gente que ha venido, la cantidad de participación que hay y la cantidad de gente maja que puedes conocer cuando te planteas las cosas de otra manera, ¿no? Yo creo que una forma de protegerse contra el desánimo, ¿no? Y contra la desesperanza, pues es plantearse otra forma de trabajar, porque planteándose otra forma de trabajar te lleva a conocer gente que posiblemente de otra manera no conocerías, ¿no? Y yo por este congreso me llevo a varias personas que he conocido y en particular a Jacqui, que no la conocí y ayer pues por la noche estuvimos hablando y la verdad es que aparte de tener una trayectoria vital increíble y de admirarla profesionalmente, pues personalmente es una persona encantadora. Así que yo sí que quería reivindicar un poco que al final los profesionales trabajamos como somos, ¿no? Es difícil ser buen profesional si uno es mala persona. Igual que es difícil ser mal profesional si uno es buena persona, ¿no? Entonces, pues sí que reivindicar un poco, aparte de la técnica, ¿no? De los manuales, de los modelos, de los protocolos, sí que reivindicar un poco el papel del ser humano, ¿no? De la humanidad, de los valores, de los principios, de la ética. Sin más, no me quiero extender mucho. Sí que quería presentar a Jacqui, ¿no? Que muchos la conoceréis. Es una respetada activista a nivel internacional, es escritora, es conferenciante también, da charlas por todo el mundo y es formadora especializada principalmente en escucha de voces, en trauma, disociación, psicosis y sobre todo, yo creo, recuperación. Ha participado en conferencias a lo largo de todo el mundo, ha escrito artículos, ha colaborado en libros también y es la presidenta de la Red Nacional de Escucha de Voces de Inglaterra y una de las personas más representativas a nivel internacional del movimiento de escucha de voces. Que de aquí también aprovecho para recordar que el 6 y 7 de noviembre el Congreso va a tener lugar aquí en Madrid, bueno, en concreto en Alcalá de Henares, y os animo a todos a que participéis y a que la gente que escucha voces y lo pasan mal, pues que les animéis a que vayan también, ¿no? Sobre todo eso, ¿no? ¿Perdón? Ah, bueno, sí, y un taller que vamos a hacer también desde la Asociación Madrileña el 7 de mayo con Fernando, que estuvo ayer por la tarde, y yo mismo, que vamos a hacer un taller práctico sobre pues, cómo son los grupos de escuchadores de voces y la filosofía que hay detrás sobre todo, ¿no? Es el 7 de marzo, he dicho, de mayo, el 7 de mayo en el Hospital Santa Cristina, donde ya hicimos uno en septiembre también a raíz de la invitación de la Madrileña. Quería dar muchísimas gracias a la Junta actual de la Madrileña por permitirme este lujo. Yo me siento hoy como, vamos, encantado de estar aquí, muy orgulloso de estar aquí compartiendo este espacio con Jacqui y de verdad muchas gracias por haber contado conmigo y por lo fácil que habéis hecho todo este proceso. Sí que quería hacer una breve introducción, ¿no? De que Jacqui tiene experiencia tanto a nivel personal como profesional. Ella también es escuchadora de voces, ¿no? Y os recomiendo que leáis las cosas que ha escrito sobre su proceso personal de recuperación, porque es una auténtica maravilla ver, ¿no? Desde la experiencia personal el proceso que sigue una persona para salir un poco pues eso, del diagnóstico, de las etiquetas, de intervenciones de profesionales muy poco respetuosas. Y ella se ha recuperado y es un ejemplo de ello. Cuando estaba preparando la presentación de Jacqui, al leer su historia, en un libro que se llama Viviendo con voces, 50 historias de recuperación, Jacqui cuenta su historia personal. Sí, no es 50 sombras de Grey, no. Y es un libro fascinante y la historia de Jacqui, al leerla, pues a uno se le caen muchos mitos, ¿no? Que tiene en la cabeza. Y me gustó mucho una coincidencia que yo tuve con ella, y es que ella plantea que hubo un libro que le marcó su vida, ¿no? Y su cambio de perspectiva, que fue Trauma y Recuperación, de Judith Herman, que seguramente algunos lo conozcáis. Y yo casualmente leí ese libro durante la residencia, mi formación, y también me cambió la forma, ¿no? de entender este tipo de cuestiones. Y sí que quería pues, plantear un par de cosas breves sobre el trauma. Una cosa que aparece en el libro de Judith Herman, muy importante, que dice que este es un libro controvertido porque habla de cosas que nadie quiere escuchar. Y yo creo que eso es algo que ha pasado mucho con la historia del trauma pues en general a nivel mundial, ¿no? Que son historias que la gente no quiere oír. Y los profesionales nos resulta incómodo escuchar estas cosas. El interés por el estudio del trauma ha variado a lo largo de la historia y ha tenido momentos que ha despertado mucho interés, sobre todo a finales del siglo XIX, principios del XX, y luego parece que desapareció. Y ahora está volviendo otra vez a aparecer este interés y una cosa que quería comentar es que muchos profesionales también estamos afectados por el trauma de alguna manera, porque cuando las personas nos lo cuentan, mucha gente se disocia. Los profesionales es como, bueno, yo me voy a centrar en esto, que quiero trabajar contigo, y esto pasó hace muchos años. Quería comentar que durante muchos años se ha minimizado el impacto del abuso sexual, del maltrato infantil, en el impacto que tiene para una persona y en cómo eso puede desarrollar luego problemas de salud mental que se pueden diagnosticar de 1000 formas, pero que en la base hay un daño muy fuerte a la persona y cómo eso se ha minimizado y se ha mirado para otro lado. Quería contar una anécdota muy, muy breve cuando estaba en la formación hubo una sesión clínica en la que se hablaba de una chica de 15 años que estaba siendo abusada sistemáticamente por su tío. Éramos 30 profesionales y la sesión clínica versaba sobre qué diagnóstico tenía la chica. La chica seguía todavía viviendo en la casa con esta persona. Entonces, ahí fue cuando yo me tomé conciencia, ¿no?, de la disociación que tenemos los profesionales. O sea, que a veces hablamos de cosas que nos interesan a nosotros, pero no creo que a esa chica saber su diagnóstico le ayudara mucho. Y nadie hablaba en la sesión cómo sacarla de ese contexto, ¿no? Entonces, pues quería hablar de eso. Y ya para terminar, para no robarle tiempo a Jacqui, sí que como ayer estaba el tema de citas, ¿no?, pues he traído como algunas citas que me gustaron mucho. Una es de Pierre Janet, a finales del siglo XIX, que planteó que la existencia de disociación, en muchos casos de psicosis, señaló que aunque el estado psicótico puede no tener relación aparente con la realidad actual, el terapeuta puede descubrir que sí que tiene relación con el pasado, con historias pasadas. Me parece, ¿no?, hace más de un siglo, pues a lo mejor igual no hemos avanzado tanto en algunas cosas, ¿no?, y en esto creo que no lo hemos hecho. Luego también Bowlby señalaba que cuando se conocen las experiencias reales que han tenido durante la infancia y se las puede tener en consideración, con frecuencia se pueden ver los miedos patológicos de los pacientes adultos ante una luz totalmente distinta. Se ve que los síntomas paranoides, a los que se había considerado como autógenos o imaginarios, son respuestas que tienen sentido, aunque distorsionadas, a episodios históricos. Y ya para terminar, quería decir una frase de Jacqui de uno de sus artículos que hace referencia al filósofo Thomas Kuhn, que también se citó ayer, y plantea que las revoluciones científicas suceden cuando las contradicciones crecientes y las anomalías empiezan a desafiar las asunciones básicas sobre las cuales un paradigma particular se asienta. Yo creo que estamos en ese momento, ¿no? Hoy, en estos 2 días ha salido aquí cantidad de cosas que cuestionan el paradigma que hemos estado manteniendo. Así que, sin más, os dejo con Jacqui, ¿vale?, que es un placer escucharla y a disfrutarlo.
It's great to be here, and thank you, Miguel, for what I think was a great introduction. It was, yeah. So thank you. So I'm very pleased to be here. It's great to see so many of you really interested in thinking about different ways of understanding and working with this thing that we call mental health. It's something that I've been involved in for quite some time. As I think Miguel shared with you, I've been an activist for many years now. And I guess what I'd like to do this afternoon is to start with my own personal experiences, which I think will set the scene very well for why I'm here today speaking to you. So I'm going to start with a story. So just sit back, relax and listen, and hopefully things will make sense. So once upon a time, there was a little girl, just an ordinary little girl, who, like all children, is born with basic human needs. The need to be fed and to be kept warm and safe. Like all children, she needs love and empathy to thrive and to grow and to fulfill her potential, like all children deserve to. But like each and every one of us, born into this magnificent and mysterious universe, the arbitrary nature of who we are born to is a random act. And like many children, far too many children in this world, she has the misfortune to be born to parents who are simply unable to provide the most basic necessities. For her parents are themselves hurt and broken children, thwarted and twisted, encased in all-powerful adult bodies, masquerading as a mother and a father. When the little girl first looks up into her mother's eyes for a reflection of herself, to know that she is real and that she exists and that she is safe in this big, scary world, she is met with a cold, hostile stare. For when the mother looks down at this scrap of humanity, her baby girl, she does not see her beauty or her innocence, but only her own helplessness, her own vulnerability, her own unmet needs. And all of these things she despises and wants to smash, stamp out, annihilate. The baby wails in terror and reaches out her small hand to this woman, her mother, and the woman laughs and bites the baby's hand, just as her own mother had done to her. The mother throws the child across her shoulder, and together they descend deep into the underworld, to a place where unspeakable acts of horror will be committed. The underworld is inhabited with many demons, monsters, and witches of the worst kind. The woman presents her possession, the child, to a man who can only be the devil. And together they laugh and they defile the child and they rob her of her innocence. The pain and the shock and the terror are too much for the child to bear, for she is being betrayed and exploited by those who are meant to protect her. And there is no escape, there is no saviour, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. All the while, the child repeats over and over to herself, "I am not here, this is not happening, I am not in this body." When all at once the child experiences a tremendous pressure building inside her head, as the urgent need to flee collides with the awful realization of her own helplessness. And then bang, there is a huge explosion as her tiny mind shatters into 1,000 little pieces. She serenely floats off into the ether and calmly looks down from a great height at the stupid girl who is left screaming in the underworld. She pities the pathetic creature, but she simply cannot be held responsible for those who refuse to help themselves. The girl inhabits a dual world. In one, she is a normal child with normal parents, a gifted child who goes to school, plays with her friends, and likes to wear ribbons in her hair. In the other world, she is a dirty little bitch, evil and unlovable, treated with cruelty and contempt by anyone who can get their filthy hands on her. Everything that she gets, she deserves. She is repeatedly threatened that if she ever tells anyone about what happens in the underworld, she will be put into prison because she has committed terrible crimes. Or everyone will think she is mad, and they will lock her in an asylum forever and throw away the key. No one will ever believe her. Or the devils, demons and witches will find her. They will always find her. They will hunt her down and they will kill her, her children, anyone or anything that she ever loves. However much she yearns for it, she has no place of safety, no saviour to rescue her. So she does what many children have to do. She survives the best way she can. The survival strategies that she unconsciously develops as a child create an illusion of control, an illusion that she has some agency over what happens to her. Despite her abject helplessness, She utilises all of the resources available to her at the time, her mind, her body, her spirit, and she fights for her life. She begins to hear voices, voices that talk to her, talk about her, who comfort her, protect her, and make her feel less alone. In time, they control and terrorise her, but help her to stay alive. One of the first voices that she hears is that of the Great Mother. She is a very powerful maternal figure who is beautiful and kind, a beneficent figure who is always there comforting and soothing her. The Great Mother is one of the girl's greatest inventions, for she is a clever little girl. Yet she keeps this illusion secret from herself for the longest time. The Great Mother is central in supporting the girl to survive with her humanity intact. And she also enables the girl to become a loving mother and compassionate mother to her own daughters when the time comes. Her body becomes the focus of her horror and her need, for there is no other place to express it. There is no one to tell. She begins to cut herself, bang her head against the wall, tear at herself, all ways she discovers of safely releasing her pain. She draws no attention to herself. She hurts no one else. No one can touch her. Her relationship with food becomes a mysterious journey of adventure on which she discovers many special powers. By controlling what she eats, overeating, forcing herself to vomit, and starving herself, she is the creator of many marvelous tricks, sleights of hand that make her feel more in control in a world that is filled with terrible, inescapable, arbitrary cruelty. For once, she has control of her body. She can do what she likes. She is mistress of her own universe. Her creativity extends beyond her body into the world. She loves writing stories and poems, drawing and painting, reading as many books as she can get her little hands on. Books allow her access into other worlds, worlds where there are endless possibilities. In the realms of her imagination, the characters and stories in books captivate and entrance her, become meaningful to her to the extent that she internalizes them inside of her so that she feels less alone, and the world still holds some magic and wonder for her. Her sense of justice is always there, burning brightly inside of her the whole time. She dreams of a world where one day she will be safe and free and loved. She finally escapes the underworld after many torturous years when she reaches womanhood. They may have broken her mind and her body, but thankfully her spirit is still intact. She is inhabited by a multitude of characters, each of whom have their part to play in helping her to survive. She does not realise this yet. For now she hears their voices and sometimes catches a glimpse of them in the mirror. But she does her best to conceal their existence to herself and everyone else. She is adept at inhabiting different worlds and used to keeping secrets locked inside of her. The voices of the devils, witches, and demons, along with those of the children still trapped in the underworld, echo in her mind long after the worst has already happened, reminding her of what they will do if she ever speaks about what has happened. So she remains silent. One day, years later, a miracle occurs, and it is now the girl who sits and looks down into the eyes of her own baby daughter. This child has been much longed for, and she is much wanted, and she is awestruck by the beauty and perfection of this tiny being. For the first time in her life, the girl's body has done something that she can feel proud of. She smiles at the baby and she beams love into her eyes, and the child knows that she is real and that she is loved and that she is safe in this big, scary world. Without warning, this idyllic scene is invaded by demons from the past. The girl's voices multiply and intensify, saying things that disturb and frighten her. She begins seeing horrifying images of abuse, torture, and death. She can feel it in her body. Marks and bruises appear on her skin like stigmata. She begins to cut herself frequently in an attempt to appease the devil, but to no effect. He is never satisfied. She becomes convinced that someone will try and kill her and her baby because she knows how dangerous the world can be for little children. She becomes intensely fearful, terrified to leave the house in case someone tries to abduct them and take them to the underworld to kill them. She fears that she is going mad, like she always knew she would, like they always said she would. She inhabits a dual world. She is a devoted mother with a close and intimate bond with her baby, breastfeeding her on demand. Yet, she knows that she is contaminating her with all of the poison that swirls around inside of her. She feels deeply ashamed of herself for being such a freak of nature, and starts to feel as if there is no escape from the horrors of the past. She sees no way out but to end her life, but she cannot bear the thought of leaving behind a motherless child. In desperation, she seeks asylum in a place that is meant to provide her with sanctuary. She hopes to find safety and support for her and her precious child, and believes that asking for help is a responsible and wise act. Perhaps when she tells them about what happened to her in the underworld, they might even congratulate her on her efforts so far. Surely they will see what a tremendous achievement it has been to get this far on her own. The witches, devils, and demons try to silence her with their vicious threats, yet she begins to tell the gatekeepers at the asylum, who assure her that they are learned men, healers in fact, about the children who have suffered in the underworld. To her astonishment, they reiterate the words of the devil. There is no underworld. She is crazy. She is ill. She was born with something wrong with her. She feels as if she's been slapped in the face, kicked while she is down, re-abused. This is insult to injury. She is wild with outrage and has to restrain herself so as not to rip them all to shreds. This reality is enough to drive anyone crazy. The place that is meant to provide her with sanctuary is the place that nearly drives her over the edge once and for all. She has escaped hell once already. She is a warrior after all, and uses whatever means necessary to deceive and trick her way past the gatekeepers. Once she is liberated, she runs as fast as she can and finds her way back to her child. She clutches her baby to her chest and gasps for breath. There is no sanctuary, yet she cannot give up hope. She has come this far. She is a woman on a mission. One day she will show them all. After much searching, she finally encounters truly wise people, brave souls who have the courage and integrity to witness her truth. As much as it pains them, They listen to her stories from the underworld and hear of the terrible suffering that many children have endured. Together, they walk down a long, winding road back to the underworld, where a process of truth and reconciliation, of listening, bearing witness, and of facing the horrors of the past can take place. The world will never look the same to them too, for they have seen the underworld. And even though she is a freak of nature, they love her and they hold her and they soothe her, and gradually she begins to feel human. She begins to feel real. She discovers that she isn't alone in quite the same way that she always had been. She begins to accept support as an act of courage and commitment to life and the future. Only then can she begin to truly mourn for all that she has lost. She did not know it was possible to cry so many tears. They continue to hold her. The most profound realization dawns on her gradually, becoming apparent incrementally over time. And then one day, she suddenly knows what she has always known. Her voices are more than just voices. They are many different selves with different names, ages, experiences, feelings, identities. Rather than trying to eradicate these different parts of her, even though they sometimes frighten her, she begins to embrace them. Each is a part of the whole of her. She begins to listen to them and to understand them and to greet them with compassion. To her delight, they teach her the mysteries of healing, alchemy, and magic. Gradually, she feels less ashamed of who she is and begins to marvel at how creative she has been in surviving the horrors of the past. At times, it feels as if she has created a work of art. On the other hand, she finds it hard to comprehend a world that often makes no sense to her, a corrupt and crazy world, which frequently exploits the vulnerable and protects the powerful. With all that she knows and all that she has seen and all that she has learnt, she cannot just stand by and let that happen. If she is to be a part of the world, then she must do what she can to make it a place that she can actually inhabit and remain sane. She begins to meet with others, warrior children, maddened men and women, fellow travellers who have escaped the underworld or some other kind of hell, as well as rebels and renegades, truth-tellers, pioneers and freedom fighters, all walking along the same path as her, seeking the same kind of justice. They too feel a collective responsibility to expose the truth and not allow further injustices to be perpetrated. They understand that being a bystander and remaining silent is the same as being complicit. They know that freedom is never given freely by those who have power. It has to be fought for. They understand that only the truth will set us free. After a long, arduous journey that has taken her many, many years to accomplish, the girl finally feels as if she has come home. She is safe now. She is free. She is loved. She still wears her battle scars with pride. She may hear the echoes from the past, but she considers herself one of the lucky ones. In many ways, she is blessed. Her life and all that she did to get here is a triumph. I think some people really like that. Thank you. So that's my story, of course. And I tell my story in lots of different ways, but I guess one of the things that I was interested in trying to to explore and play with was telling the story from the perspective of the child. And because one of the things that really strikes me is that many of the things that send people crazy happen to them when they're younger. And what happens, of course, is that what we end up with is an adult in front of us, and that story of why they have ended up sitting in front of us never gets told. I was also interested in trying to explore a way of telling the story to explain the ways in which dissociation works. As I said in the story, I was badly abused as a child. My parents were involved with a group of organised paedophiles who abused me and many other children in the area in which I lived. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the consequence of that kind of abuse is devastating. To be exploited and betrayed by the very people who are meant to protect you leaves you feeling shattered. And I felt shattered into many, many pieces. The first person that I ever told about my abuse, because of course I'd been badly threatened by the people that hurt me, so the first person I told was a psychiatrist. And very quickly when I began to share these experiences, he stopped me and told me that these things hadn't actually happened to me, but that they were symptoms of a serious illness. That in fact I was delusional, and that these were not real experiences that I'd had, which actually made me feel more mad and desperate, of course. And I remember when he told me that, leaving his office and walking down the corridor and going into the ladies' bathrooms and going into the toilet and smashing my head against the wall. Because I knew then that the place that was meant to provide me with safety was actually the place that was going to drive me the most crazy. I was very, very lucky to escape that hospital. And I did what many patients do in that circumstance. I told the staff what they wanted to hear. That actually, I don't believe those things anymore. And yes, you're right, I'm ill. But I feel better now, thank you. And I left. I was then very, very lucky to find a therapist to work with who did believe me. And he believed that sometimes adults do terrible things to children. And he also understood that the voices that I was hearing, the visions that I was seeing, these horrible experiences that I was having in my body were all consequences of the horrendous abuse that I'd experienced as a child. He also believed that I was more than the terrible things that had happened to me. Despite my terror and my despair, he saw an intelligent woman who was creative and who had the potential to lead a good life. And I am so grateful that he was able to hold that hope and that possibility for me when I was not able to hold it for myself. We began working together, and even though he was an experienced therapist, he'd never worked with anybody who had these extreme experiences. For me, that was quite comforting because it felt like we were in it together. And rather than him being the expert and me having to be this passive little person, that actually we were a team and we worked together as a team, and that equality was very, very important for me. After we'd been working together for about 3 or 4 months, he handed me a copy of this book, Trauma and Recovery, which I think Miguel spoke about in his introduction. And this book blew my mind in a good way. The New York Times describes it as one of the most important psychiatric works to be published since Freud. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, really. But for me, reading this book was life-changing. It's written by an American psychiatrist, and for me, the fact that this book was written by a psychiatrist who was speaking to the things that had happened to me was very powerful, because this was a voice of psychiatry that was wise. And for me, her ideas and the framework that she advocates was life-changing. So one of the things that Judith Herman in her book does, the first half of the book is a kind of historical analysis of the ways in which we as societies have known that traumatizing things traumatize people, but then because it becomes socially and politically inconvenient, we bury that knowledge. And of course she starts with the work of Freud, who did exactly that, began to listen to his female patients' experiences of childhood sexual abuse, to only then turn around and say these were not real experiences, that these were fantasies, because Freud was being funded by Austrian aristocracy. So it became complicated and inconvenient to maintain these ideas. So she does this historical analysis, bringing us up to the present day, to the current psychiatric system. And I'm going to get onto some of those ideas shortly. But the other thing that she does is in the second half of the book, is that she outlines a model of healing and recovery that I found very, very helpful. And she has a number of quotes from survivors of torture and people that have been prisoners of war and people who have been tortured in more domestic situations through childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, etc. And one of the things that was so important to me was to understand my own personal experiences in a much wider social and political context. That was so, so important. And that was the beginnings of my growth as an activist. The other thing that was very important is that she advocates a way of working with people which fundamentally honours their survivorhood. What she's saying is that even if you have had terrible experiences, with good help, you can lead a good life. And for me, that was such a wonderful thing to hear. So she outlines a kind of an approach for working with people, and in the first phase it's about establishing safety, and in the second phase then to support people to begin to remember the things that have happened to them, the things that have broken them, and in that process people can begin to feel the feelings, and really that is where healing occurs, when your experiences and your suffering is witnessed by another human being. This very powerful process whereby having someone see your pain and honour your pain becomes transformed. And the final part of the process is about this reconnection with community and society. So one of the things that Judith Herman does is actually reframe many so-called psychiatric diagnoses. And what she's saying is that people are having real and meaningful reactions to the terrible things that have happened to them. Now, I'm somebody who has campaigned a lot in England to get rid of diagnoses. I don't think diagnoses are helpful, but that's another talk. But for me, this idea of complex trauma, complex post-trauma that Judith Herman advocated, is an important stepping stone towards actually beginning to see that all people who end up in psychiatry, I believe, have stories and they have reasons why they are distressed and have gone mad. So she describes people as having difficulties with their attachment relationships. I heard Miguel reference John Bowlby's work, and of course John Bowlby, the founding father of attachment theory, his work is now coming back into fashion as a crucial link in understanding psychosis, this thing that we call psychosis. Dissociation, which I'm going to talk about more, that many people who are very traumatized dissociate. They may have big blocks in their memory, they may hear voices, they may be having flashbacks about the trauma, which are often understood as delusions and as symptoms of a serious illness. In terms of their behaviour, difficulty with their sleep, etc. And again, there's a growing body of literature now coming out of Judith Herman's work. So, for example, Bruce Perry, wonderful American psychiatrist, who is doing a lot of work looking at the neurophysiology, the impact on the brain of developing children in terms of trauma. I'm going to come back to some of these ideas, but I think we are finally beginning to understand the impact of our experiences on people in terms of people's cognitions, their emotions, and their self-concept. And interestingly, people who meet the criteria for complex trauma, in fact, often receive diagnoses of schizophrenia, of course, and increasingly, and particularly if you're a woman, borderline personality disorder. BPD, so borderline personality BPD, or as some of us like to call it, bullshit psychiatric disorder. And of course, it's important to note that all the first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia are prevalent in people who meet the criteria for complex trauma. So there's been a number of campaigns internationally to get rid of this unevidenced diagnosis of schizophrenia, which very much locates the problems in people's brains rather than asking people what has happened in your life. And one of the things that people are talking about is to talk about traumatic psychosis. So to bring the idea that actually very traumatic experiences can cause these things that we now currently call psychosis. In the latter part of the outline of her work, Judith Herman talks about, in this reconnection phase, about the need for survivors to find a survivor mission. She rightfully, to my mind, acknowledges that when terrible things have been done to you, and as I described, I had these very traumatic experiences as a child, and then when I sought help, felt re-abused by my experiences of the so-called help. One of the things that Judith Herman says is that, understandably, people feel outraged about this. But one of the difficulties that many people's anger just ends up becoming a destructive force in their own life. So one of the things that she says is very important is for people to find a survivor mission. A place where you can become part of a collective movement to bring about change. So for me, being here today, speaking to you, is part of my survivor mission. So it's about social action and about a willingness to speak the unspeakable. So it's also another way of pursuing justice. And this very important need to speak publicly about the truth. Because, of course, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. So it's not about revenge or seeking compensation for an atrocity, but it's about transcending your suffering and the horror that has happened to you and making it a gift to other people. So this is my gift to you, everyone. Out of my suffering, this is my gift to you. One of the things that Judith Herman talks about is the need for people to share their testimonies. And of course, my work within the Hearing Voices movement, one of the things that's very powerful about Hearing Voices, the Hearing Voices movement, is that we create places for people to begin to share their testimonies. So this sociologist and psychiatrist who have written a lot about the work of testimony describe the act of testimony as a ritual with two purposes. So when a survivor testifies, she both purges herself of an internal evil and bears witness to a social or political injustice. So the word testimony has in itself a double connotation of both something objective, judicial, public or political, and of something subjective, spiritual, cathartic or private. Thus, the use of the word testimony implies that the subjective, private pain is to be seen in an objective, political context. So, one of the things that Judith Herman talks a lot about is this mechanism of dissociation. My experience both in the UK and in my work around the world, I travel a lot. And one of the things that I see is that we often have these two different categories. One is dissociation and the other is psychosis. And of course, when people are deemed to be experiencing psychosis, traditionally those experiences, the voices that they hear, the visions that they may see, the ideas that they may have about their experiences, the things that may be happening in their bodies are seen as symptoms of an illness. But one of the things that I and Olga and other people in this room and many people around the world are advocating is that this thing called psychosis is just a reaction to the terrible things that have happened to people. So this is quite a long quote from Judith Herman, but she says the psychological distress symptoms of traumatized people simultaneously call attention to the existence of an unspeakable secret and deflect attention from it. So this is most apparent in the way traumatized people alternate between feeling very numb and then reliving the event. So the dialectic of trauma gives rise to complicated, sometimes uncanny alterations of consciousness, which George Orwell, one of the committed truth tellers of our century, called doublethink, and which mental health professionals searching for calm, precise language call dissociation. So this idea of doublethink, I think, is very important. So as Judith Herman says, doublethink comes out of the famous novel by George Orwell, the British author George Orwell, and his famous novel 1984. And in 1984, George Orwell is describing this universe in the future where the residents of that universe are asked to hold contradictory beliefs. So, for example, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. So this kind of doublethink is unlike cognitive dissonance. With cognitive dissonance, of course, you see that you are holding contradictory beliefs in your mind at the same time. The difference with doublethink is this lack of cognitive dissonance. So you're holding these contradictory thoughts, but you're unaware that they actually don't make sense. So Judith Herman talks about the ways in which trauma actually creates this kind of doublethink in people. I would like to extend that metaphor, and I would say that many of the theories and practices within traditional psychiatry are a form of doublethink. So, for example, diagnoses, which many, of course, are unevidenced. We've just had the new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which came out last year, DSM-5 came out. And of course, many of those diagnoses, people, you know, the general public believe that there are there's scientific evidence for a lot of these new diagnoses. But in fact, what we have are a group of psychiatrists sitting in a room together voting whether they think this should be included or not. Of course, the other thing to remember is that 70% of the psychiatrists who helped to write the new DSM were in receipt of drug company money. So diagnoses are spoken of as real things, as facts, when in fact what they are, in my belief, is a subjective opinion masquerading as a fact. So diagnosis, I think, is a good example of doublethink. I think, you know, many of the theories that are very commonly used in mental health, things like the stress vulnerability model, I'm guessing that's a belief, a hypothesis that's popular here. Stress vulnerability, yeah. Again, the stress vulnerability model is an idea. There's no proof. But yet we speak as if it is a fact. And of course, one of the good things about the stress vulnerability model is even if somebody like me goes into psychiatric services and says these terrible things have happened to me, what happens is that these terrible experiences just get reduced to a trigger, a mere trigger. Because actually, I was apparently born with this genetic inferiority. Lovely. And of course, much of the language that we use within psychiatry and within mental health facilitates doublethink. So there's a very interesting paper by a good friend of mine where he examines closely patients' records, and what he finds is that patients will be talking about experiences of things like, I feel as if the devil is trying to rape me and get into my body, and that then gets reported as auditory and visual hallucinations. So immediately the context is removed, which again, I think this need to decontextualize unconsciously is part of doublethink. So doublethink operates on all levels, in all contexts. And as Judith Herman says, you know, in terms of dissociation, the knowledge of horrible events periodically intrudes into public awareness, but it is rarely retained for long. So denial, repression, and dissociation operate on a social as well as an individual level. So actually, despite this doublethink, there is a growing body of evidence which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, which demonstrate that actually there is a whole wide range of adversities that are predictors of many forms of serious mental health issues, including psychosis. So this is from a paper that was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry back at the end of 2012. So there's a growing body of literature now that shows that there are many different kinds of adversity that can happen to people. So mother's ill health, poor nutrition, high stress during pregnancy, being the product of an unwanted pregnancy, early loss of parents via death or abandonment, attachment difficulties. So many studies being carried out in the UK now with people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, looking at their early attachment experiences and how that may have contributed to some of their difficulties. witnessing interparental violence, this very, I think, important concept of intergenerational trauma, which for me makes a lot more sense than this unevidenced, many of the unevidenced genetic theories that we currently have. Dysfunctional parenting, particularly, there's been quite a lot of studies looking at this, a particular kind of parenting, this kind of affectionless over control that seems to be very damaging to children's mental health. Parental substance misuse, mental health problems and criminal behaviour. Of course, the obviously traumatising things like childhood sexual, physical and emotional abuse, childhood emotional or physical neglect, bullying, childhood medical illness, war trauma, poverty, racism, and other forms of social inequality. So this is by John Reed and Richard Bentel. So as I said, this was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, which of course is the journal of biological psychiatry in England. But even within very traditional biological psychiatry, they are now having to take on board this huge body of evidence that is growing, because I think finally we are asking people the right questions. And I think, you know, one of the important things is that we need to stop asking people, what is wrong with you? We need to ask people, what has happened to you? What is your story? And of course, just to underline this, again, there are many studies which show that in countries where there is a greater disparity between the rich and the poor, that there's more madness, there's more mental illness in the general population. And of course, leading the way for that is the USA, closely followed by the UK, in fact. And under the wonderful Conservative government we currently have, that gap has actually gotten bigger. And as a consequence, there have been more people admitted to hospital, there have been more suicides, there have been more prescriptions for psychiatric medications. So there's very strong connection between poverty and madness, distress. Spain looks like it's doing pretty good there, so well done, Spain. And then thinking specifically about childhood adversity and psychosis, there are many, many studies now showing that childhood adversity puts you at a much higher risk of going on into developing this thing that we call psychosis. So, for example, research indicates that those abused as children 9.3 times more likely to develop psychosis. For those suffering the severest kinds of abuse, the risk rises to 48 times. It's important to note these are big studies. These are not small studies. These are in the thousands. This is another big study, a British study. People have endured 3 kinds of abuse. So, for example, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and bullying, 18 times higher risk of psychosis. Whereas those experiencing 5 types, 193 times more likely to become psychotic. It's just extraordinary, I think. Furthermore, individuals with psychosis are 3 times more likely to have experienced childhood sexual abuse than those with other diagnoses, and 15 times more likely to have been abused than non-patients. Which, of course, is not to say that everyone who experiences psychosis has experienced childhood sexual abuse, but certainly in terms of voice hearing, and again, there are a lot of studies now, and it seems more and more that this is something we should at least be asking people and exploring with them, because the evidence is just kind of extraordinary, actually. And this link does appear to be a causal one, because, of course, one of the ways that doublethink operates is that you get very biologically minded psychiatrists saying things like, well, you know, I'm sure a child in the early stages of the disease would be triggered into illness by a childhood sexual abuse experience. So for me, that's a very nice example of doublethink. Not that actually being abused and hurt by the very people that are meant to protect you actually may be enough to drive you crazy in and of itself. But there does seem to be this dose-dependent relationship too, which simply means that the severity, the frequency, and the number and types of adverse experience actually increase the likelihood that you will go on and develop psychosis. And then just to kind of really bring this point home, one of the ways that biological psychiatry has understood people's biology is to see that people are born with differences in their brains. So some people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, not all people, of course, if you do an fMRI scan, for some people, there will be changes in their brains. There will be certain irregularities, there will be certain asymmetry, there will be certain areas of the brain that will be more damaged, and certain areas of the brains that have not developed properly. So for many, many years, the assumption has been that people are born with these changes in their brains. Very good friend of mine who I've done a lot of work with, Professor John Reed, went and did a piece of research. And what he did is actually he compared the brain scans of people who had been subject to very traumatic things like torture. He also compared the brain scans of people of children that we know have been subject to horrible abuse, and we know that because it's contemporary and there is kind of forensic evidence to back that up. And what he found is that people who had experienced extreme trauma had exactly the same changes within their brain. So actually, I think this is very important because what it does is it offers us a fully integrated bio-psycho-social model, but what it doesn't do is privilege biology above everything else and reduce the psychological aspects of people's experiences and the social aspects of people's experiences as mere triggers. That in fact, what I think this is saying to us is that these things are, of course, all interconnected with each other. So this is called the traumagenic neurodevelopment model of psychosis, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it needs to sound proper, doesn't it? It needs to sound scientific. So I think this is really important because it offers, for me, a more helpful explanation as to why some people have these changes in their brains. The other thing that I think is really important about it is that these changes do not have to be permanent. That actually there is a growing body of evidence which shows that with the right kinds of support, that people's brains can literally change shape. So there's lots of, of course, babies and children, their brains have a greater capacity because their brains are still developing. But even for people that have been chronically traumatized, there are a number of studies being carried out. For example, if we offer somebody a long-term therapeutic alliance, that you can literally see the changes in their brains. So for me, that's very exciting and very, very hopeful. If you're interested in some of this research that I've just presented, unfortunately it's in English. We are looking for a Spanish publisher currently, so hopefully this will become available in Spain. But Models of Madness really is, so a book that I co-edited with John Reed. This is really a summary of all of this research that I've just presented. So it's really looking at psychological, social and biological approaches to psychosis in a much more kind of integrated way. So for me, the antidote to doublethink is this, that in every presentation of distress, in theory, in research, in teaching, in case discussions, in media presentations, and in everyday conversations between service users and professionals, would have at its centre, unless there is strong evidence to the contrary, the idea that people's feelings and actions are consonant with their past and present experiences. So people make sense. And I guess part of our job, if people, if we as professionals are meeting somebody who is sharing stuff that seems really crazy, to begin to try and see the meaning in their madness, because madness makes sense. As I said, I feel like I'm one of the lucky ones. I was very fortunate to have some good help. I'm part of this worldwide movement trying to bring about change within mental health and within the ways that we think about people who have had what we call madness. And I guess my plea to you is to continue to work together, because there are many forces against us. There are many people who have, I think, a huge investment in maintaining the status quo. So we have to work together. We have to work together at all different levels. And we must not give up hope. Thank you for listening, everyone. I need to sort out my headphones, I think.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Jacqui, por esta presentación tan brillante, que yo creo que espero y deseo que nadie de los que estamos aquí salgamos igual que hemos entrado, ¿no? O sea, que nos toque esto que hemos escuchado, porque yo creo que se puede decir más alto, pero más claro, yo creo que es difícil, ¿no?, que el argumento que ha dado. Muchas gracias. Como estamos cortos de tiempo, sí que podemos abrir un turno de preguntas. Sí que agradecería de verdad que fueran breves para que pudiera tener tiempo para contestar, porque se tiene que ir. Entonces, hacer las preguntas breves, ¿vale?, para que ella pueda contestar. Y de verdad, mil gracias, Jacqui, porque ha sido un placer escucharte y creo que a más de uno nos has puesto la piel de gallina. Y sí que algo muy importante, que yo lo único que quiero señalar es que estas cosas generan optimismo, esperanza, ¿no?, y ganas de hacer cosas, ¿no? O sea, que a pesar de que pues algunos nos emocionemos, nos toque de alguna manera a cada uno en su medida, esto da ganas de trabajar para cambiar las cosas. Así que mil gracias. Aprovechar que se tiene que coger el avión, o sea que...
¿Perdón? Sí. Me dicen que me ponga de pie. A ver. Gracias, Jacqui, por tu testimonio. Creo que, como decía Miguel, nos puede tocar de alguna manera. Me ha hecho reflexionar sobre lo cotidiano también y lo sencillo que puede ser los propios traumas, quizá más normales, ¿no?, que podemos haber experimentado todos. Me ha hecho pensar sobre ello. Creo, trabajo como psicólogo y muy adoctrinado en un modelo biologicista, etcétera, etcétera, y dándome cuenta con experiencias como la tuya de este doble lenguaje. Cuanto más me doy cuenta, más tengo que hacer algo para conservar mi salud mental y quería decir simplemente un poco esto, agradecértelo y compartir mi experiencia de que cuanto más es el profesional consciente, la persona que puede ayudar, ¿no?, que podemos estar consciente de nuestras propias debilidades, y en este sentido te ayuda a ponerte a un nivel de horizontalidad como ese del que hablabas, que es la única manera, yo creo, razonable y honesta de entendernos entre personas y acompañarnos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Jacqui. Muchísimas gracias por este testimonio. Hemos trabajado con personas que han pasado experiencias como la tuya quiero hacerte una pregunta muy sincera y directamente. Cuando has hablado de las cosas que te ayudaron a seguir viva, las estrategias de supervivencia inconscientes, quiero entender que todo lo que son síntomas positivos en los diagnósticos psiquiátricos se refieren justamente a eso. Y quiero entender que yo tengo formación dinámica, psicoanalítica, pero estoy bastante alejada de los modelos ortodoxos. Y quiero entender que, a pesar de todo, tenemos una deuda con Freud en el sentido de que las fantasías y las alucinaciones son precisamente esas estructuras de supervivencia inconsciente que han permitido a muchas personas llegar al lugar de encontrarse con alguien para ser escuchados en otra forma y reconstruir el proceso del sentido que tuvieron para llegar a otro puerto. Eso en cuanto a la pregunta. En cuanto a los que estamos aquí, creo que cuando has dicho que teniendo tu cuerpo roto y tu mente rota, pero no tu espíritu, soy de los que piensan que nosotros estamos aquí para alimentar un espíritu de utopía que nos permita generar espacios de lucha que hagan que nos encontremos las personas que hemos tenido algo en común, por lo menos los interrogantes en común. Gracias.
I agree that we owe Freud a lot, and I think it's also important to critique everyone. And actually, the fact that Freud did this huge turnaround and decided that these things were not real events, I think has been hugely destructive, actually. And I think that has to be named. But nevertheless, of course, he's made hugely important contributions. The fact that we have this concept of the unconscious, we can thank Freud for. So, and of course, in my work with people with this thing that we call psychosis, stuff manifests sometimes in very literal ways. People are having just very direct and literal memories, but also sometimes things are much more symbolic and metaphorical. And yes, so for me it's really important to be able to sort of hold both possibilities, multiple dimensions in terms of what possible meanings there may be for somebody. I also believe that these sort of events are really important because I do a lot of work within traditional settings, and many of my good friends are psychologists and psychiatrists who, like I think many people here, are trying to bring about change. And actually it becomes very difficult to do that on your own. And I have friends who work within services who end up feeling very discouraged and disheartened because sometimes they feel that they're the only one in their team who really is trying to understand things in a different way. And that is kind of can make you feel like giving up. So I think events like this are really important. I think having allies who share similar values and ideas, and as you say, a kind of utopian vision for how we would like the future to be is so important. So thank you. Has everybody had enough? Any last questions, comments?
Hola, gracias Jacqui, porque he tenido una catarsis muy buena, o sea, muy mala y muy buena, es decir, que no quiero que me entiendas mal. Yo quería decir que esa llamada que tú estás haciendo a que los profesionales se unan a esta, que al final es una lucha por la justicia, ¿no? El comprendernos y el ayudarnos unas personas a otras es una lucha por la justicia. Y en el caso concreto de las personas que hemos pasado por este tipo de experiencias de sufrimiento psíquico, independientemente de las causas, ¿no? que las mencionaste tú, muy variadas, estamos encontrando en el apoyo entre iguales, ¿no? En el apoyo mutuo, muchas veces lo que no estamos encontrando, quiero pensar que todavía, en el sistema de salud mental. Entonces, si la gente, si los profesionales del sistema de salud mental no quieren luchar, digamos, con nosotras, ¿no? Lo vamos a hacer nosotras solas, ¿no? Entonces, al final, a lo mejor la gente dejará de contar con los profesionales si encuentra mejor ayuda fuera del sistema de salud mental. Entonces, es una idea que quiero dejar ahí, ¿no? Para la reflexión también.
Absolutely, and of course one of the things that I think is really powerful about the Hearing Voices movement, this international movement, which was pioneered by a Dutch psychiatrist, but is a really powerful example of psychiatry, psychology, nursing, all different professions working alongside as equals with people with lived experience, is really, really powerful and important. And it kind of goes back, it reminds me of the point that you just made, that actually, you know, many people who come to work within mental health have their own stories. And I guess one of the things that I am most interested is moving beyond the them and the us. That actually, I believe we're all in this together. And that we have to work together to bring about these changes. So, here.
Gracias. Primero de todo, muchísimas gracias, Jacqui. Una pregunta muy breve. Soy residente de psicología clínica. Models of Madness era uno de los primeros libros que leí sobre psicosis y ya desde el principio de la carrera me dejó impactada, como yo creo, de forma muy positiva. Muchas veces luego cuando te incorporas ya al mundo más profesional, y en general los profesionales con los que uno se va encontrando, y decía lo de residente porque todavía tengo muy poca experiencia clínica real, especialmente con trastorno mental, con psicosis. Lo que oigo muchísimo de psiquiatras y psicólogos con más experiencia es justo eso. Quizá algunas pocas personas eso puede tener alguna influencia, cuando yo quizá presento más ese tipo de versión. Cuando yo pregunto, simplemente no podría ser que, y siempre recibo la misma respuesta, quizá algunos pocos, la mayoría, o hay casos en los que directamente no tiene nada que ver, orgánico, puro y duro, y ya está. ¿Qué opinas tú al respecto? Muchísimas gracias.
I would ask for their evidence of that. And I would get a copy of Models of Madness, which would contest that with I would say, much more robust evidence. You know, many of the biological theories are unevidenced. They're hypotheses, they are ways of thinking. So, for example, you know, the brain scans that I showed, for many years that would have been held up as evidence that something like schizophrenia is an organic brain disease. And now I think we have, you know, more helpful ways of understanding that actually people's brains are damaged by the horrible things that happen to them. So for me, this pessimistic, unevidenced way of thinking about people's experiences must be challenged. And actually, my experience is that people who say that are not up to date with the contemporary research. So one of my ways of trying to challenge that is to know my stuff. I subscribe to, you know, the psychiatric journals and keep very familiar with all the research that's coming out, because I think that's a kind of weapon that we can use against ideas that often are unevidenced. So my thing would be, so what's your evidence? Could you show me that? Because I don't understand that. Because what the research is saying is that actually, you know, people who go mad do so for good reasons, which I'm sure from the way you're nodding you knew already. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I hope I haven't been too challenging. I hope it was helpful, and thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Muchas gracias, Jacqui. Y ahora Iván va... quería comentar solo 2 cosas rápidas de lo que estabais hablando. Un tema, por ejemplo, que pasa mucho con lo de las personas diagnosticadas, el por qué no están, a veces, ¿no? Ayer hablándolo con Nando, una cosa que me comentaba, que sí que lo quería comentar aquí, es que hay mucha gente que está fuera de todo esto, ¿no? Y que está haciendo cosas, pero que a lo mejor no hablan en público. Porque claro, subirse aquí delante hay mucha gente que le da vergüenza, se pone nerviosa, pero no significa que no. Hay mucha gente, lo que pasa es que a lo mejor no toda esa gente quiere ser pública, quiere hablar, pero sí que existe. Y es verdad que no creo que España sea un país distinto en ese sentido, ¿no? Si en otros países hay mucha gente que está saliendo, aquí también las hay, ¿no? Y algunos los conocemos, pero es verdad que hay gente que a lo mejor quiere vivir su vida de manera anónima y no está metido en esto, pero que sí que están, ¿vale? Quería puntualizar eso, que sí que me parece importante, ¿no? Que hay mucha más gente y no puede ser que ese ellos y nosotros, o sea, esto es algo de todos, ¿no? Solo quería comentar eso.
Bueno, voy a cerrar las jornadas porque me toca. Agradeceros, bueno, primero a Jacqui, que creo que ha sido estupendo. Vamos, a mí me ha encantado. Muchísimas gracias por haber venido. Os agradezco de corazón.